Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This episode is the second part of a three-part series with Professor Orlando Patterson on the history and development of the value of freedom. So, contrary to what most of philosophy says, we're arguing here that freedom is not a natural value. It was a value that was invented in response to specific circumstances, specifically the circumstances of large-scale slavery in the ancient world, but for those circumstances, people wouldn't desire freedom, at least as we understand it. So this is the second part of the series. In the first part, I introduce Orlando Patterson, and we discuss the nature and earliest forms of slavery. In this part, we talk about Athens, how freedom developed there as a value, why it developed specifically there, and we discuss our own uncomfortability with acknowledging the historic uniqueness of Athens. Then in the final part, we'll talk about the role of freedom in Rome and in early Christianity. So, if you want the context to this conversation, you're more than welcome to go back and start with the first part of the series. If you don't care too much for context, and I think this episode should stand on its own, then please do just join us and check it out. If you like these conversations, we have a new one coming out every week, so please do like, subscribe. There's a whole bunch of ways you can follow us. Check out the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And if you want to support the podcast, to help keep these conversations going out to everyone who wants to listen to them for free, then there's a whole bunch of ways you can support that. One thing that's really easy to do is just share these episodes on your own social media, helps them reach a larger audience, or if you have friends who you think would like them, forward or tag them in the post. If you want to support it in a more monetary way, we have a Patreon account, and we suggest a donation for regular listeners of $2 an episode. Way I've been putting that is, if you get the same enjoyment as you do a cup of coffee, sponsor it on that basis. Or if that seems like a weird amount to you, whatever makes sense. So, big thank you as always to anyone who sponsors, shares, or forwards the show. Anyone who does that, you are making the show possible. I'm really, genuinely grateful. Apart from that, please do like and subscribe, and let's get straight to it. This is part 2 with Professor Orlando Patterson. Let's make explicit something that we've been alluding to all conversation, which is the uniqueness of freedom historically. Because, let me give a summary and then you tell me if it's right and build off it. Basically, in the tribal societies we're talking about, the idea of freedom as we think about it not only doesn't exist, but cannot exist, because safety, protection, meaning is found in relationships, in overlapping systems of protection. And the idea, if you think about humanity's origins in small tribes of maybe 150 people, the idea of freedom as we think about it, of lack of interpersonal constraints, would be equivalent to complete social orphanage, complete social isolation and probably physical death. And so the idea of I need to be left alone to mind my own business is simply inconceivable. And that even once you get to, say, more settled societies like Egypt, Mesopotamia, the social structure is a hierarchy of clienteles. So the idea of you being separated from systems of would be absolutely unthinkable. And I think freedom is so hardwired into us. We have this understanding that obviously everyone desires it, but actually most people throughout human history couldn't even conceive of it. And the analogy I use is if you think about homelessness today in America. We would agree that homelessness is a bad thing. We would agree that it's desirable to not be homeless. But if you said, what is the goal of our society? No one would ever say, our goal is to have a non-homeless society, or my highest aspiration in life is to be non-homeless. It just wouldn't make sense. And so the idea of freedom as a value, that is just, it wouldn't even occur to people. Most people in human history, and non-Western people prior to contact with the West, it just wouldn't occur to them to think about it like that. Did I get that summary right? And what would you want to add?
Absolutely right, which then makes it problematic. How did this happen?
Right, not just like, we go and we're like, so George Bush says, well, it's just, natural that everyone desires freedom, and then when you get the contradictions of that exposed in the world, we say, well, what's wrong with people that they don't want freedom in our sense? We should instead be asking, what's so weird about us that we do?
Right, exactly. And, it leads, for one, to the view that it's not, to the idea which is so common that is hardwired into us, and that everyone, given the chance, would desire freedom. It's simply not true. There are many, many societies where it did not happen, where indeed it's viewed as an abomination. Indeed, I got several of my Asian students to sort of do etymological work for me on the origins of the word freedom. Freedom is now in all languages, but that's just because of the influence of the West. But it's an interesting exercise to sort of examine what are the roots of the idea. So my favorite sort of imaginary story is, many dictionaries of Eastern societies were written by missionaries at the end of their failed attempt after 30 years of proselytizing anyone. They said, well, let's do something useful and sort of get a dictionary of this language. So you go around and you ask people, what's your word for rat? What's your word for cat? What so on and so forth. And then you get to concepts. And I always imagine at an interaction in which he said, well, okay, now, you can have here's a more difficult idea, but tell me what's your word for freedom? And the response very invariably has been, well, what do you mean? So the missionary then would have to say, well, I'll tell you what I mean by it, and you tell me what your word is. Now, what's very interesting is what the response when the light bulb goes off. Aha, I think I know what you mean. The word given and the literal meaning, this becomes very important, is usually what, say, the Chinese did, which is, the word given is the word meaning licentiousness. The same thing as in Japan. It means irresponsible, selfishness and so on. The literal meaning of freedom, it translated, and is always something negative, because people just thought that this was not a good idea. So the question then arises, how did this happen? How did an idea, especially given the fact that it has this association with one of the most horrible experiences, as you mentioned, it's like taking the idea of not being homeless and making it into a central value. So that was the big question then. How did such an idea with such a degraded pedigree associated with the most degraded people, slaves, and the most degraded condition become the preeminent value in the West, assuming that this is how it originated? By the way, that's part of the reason why many people refuse to admit that our noble concept of freedom could have anything to do with slavery. Simply deny it. And that's where Greece comes in, and later Rome, because it's in Athens, and well, we know most about Athens, but it could have happened in several of the other states.
You always want to avoid the trap of this sort of ringing, chest-thumping narrative about Athens inventing Western civilization, but I don't want to fall into that like historical narrative. But you have to Athens really is unique, right? Or at least Greece as a whole, and the concepts that they come up with. It really is strikingly unusual socio-historically.
this is my biggest problem. Having grown up as a colonial, with colonial education, with the usual, all civilization begins. Anything worthwhile in human thought begins with the Greeks, and of course culminated with the British. It was an idea which I strongly resisted because, for most of my undergraduate and my later years, I said that's a whole lot of European ethnocentrism. But facts are facts, and it is quite clear that the idea of freedom did not emerge in other societies which had slavery. And even though they have words for it, as a concept, it was not seen as important. So how on earth did this idea become important? And it's in Athens, in which we have a lot of data. It may have a version of it may have well emerged in Sparta and in some of the other states. But there is this very close relationship between the rise of slavery and the rise of freedom consciousness in Athens. And you can trace this very closely to its culmination in the latter half of the 5th century BC, the development of this idea as important. Now, interestingly, the revulsion of this idea being associated against this idea being associated with slavery also existed in Greece, and here's where things get complicated because the elite scholars who we read and whose work we're primarily sort of indebted to our knowledge of Greece. Were similarly rather disdainful of the idea of freedom in a secular external sense, but they couldn't deny it. So what did they do? You had the very important move by Plato.
Plato's such a sort of old school conservative, though. He really exactly hates this.
He was, in his conservatism, he was horrified about this idea. But he could not do without it because by time, it was very entrenched. The idea of we Greeks being free, and freedom is one of the most wonderful things. So what did he do? His move was to internalize it and to deny the external significance of freedom as that this is a monastic. And this elaborate development of the idea of inner freedom as being the critical factor. And of course, and it's very well documented. Vasilos, one of the great sort of students of Plato's thought, has a wonderful, long essay on slavery and Plato's thought, which is where I originally sort of got this idea that he interprets it. So, one way in which elites sort of deal with problems, ideas which emerge externally from the masses or from circumstances which they find abhorrent, is to internalize it and to say, well, real freedom. So began, if you like, the discursive, prescriptive view of freedom from the very beginning. To deny its external significance is dangerous, and to see it, well, true freedom is. But then he lifted it completely. It's the slavery was sort of associated with the base emotions, and true freedom is control of these base emotions. And this is an elaborate way, and this was, as I try to explain in Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, the idea was then picked up and developed in far more sophisticated ways by the Stoics and by others.
Let's just pause there before we get to the Stoics, though, because even by the time of Plato, the fact that he's reacting to it means that it's already a thing, right?
It's already. The Sophists, which he was, of course, blasting, had well developed the idea.
So just let me offer one thing, then anybody can do this. You don't need to have like a research library, that I always have used as an example if anyone's still doubting what we're saying and is still like retaining an impulse that freedom must be like this natural universal thing, is take a collection of documents from the ancient Near East pre-Hellenization, i.e. pre-Greek influence, and one post, after Greek influence. And everyone has access to this. It's called the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, right? Go through and just do a keyword search of the Bible, and you'll see every time it's mentioned, freedom or some related concept is mentioned about 100 times in the Old Testament, about 100 times in the New. Every single time in the Old Testament, it's a descriptive. It's describing an institution or a state of affairs, such as the Israelites' captivity in Babylon or something like that. And it's again, in the way that we would use homelessness and non-homelessness. And then there's a few weird ones like free sacrifices, which we don't need to go into, but it doesn't relate to the value. And then look at how it's used in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it's clearly as an aspirational value. It's a completely different meaning behind the word. So something's happened, and it happened in Greece, that meant... I mean, like, I come from a similar place in terms of my desired reading of history, where I don't want a triumphalist narrative. I'm always looking to sort of play the other side, the like Howard Zinn reading of history. But then when you get to Athens, it's like a light being turned on. It's just something radically different to anything that's happened before, and you just have to contend with that. So what...
I'm afraid, yeah, you're describing a struggle I had for well over a year as I rejected this idea. But, but by the way, to get back to the Bible, it's interesting, and there's a huge difference between Jesus, who refers to slavery quite a bit, who's using the word very much in the Old Testament way. I mean, a lot of the parallels referred parables.
Let's finish with Christianity. But what happened in Greece? What, as a historical sociologist, what the hell has changed that they suddenly have this thing that's absolutely revolutionary, individually and politically and societally? And what happened there? Why was freedom created?
Yeah, that's what happened, and what was unique in human history, different from anything that existed in the ancient Near East, was the invention of large-scale slave society, as opposed to simply slave-holding societies, which you had all over the world, and from primitive times right through, and certainly all over the ancient Near East. What emerged for the first time in history was this unusual phenomenon of a large-scale society, of a society whose economy, and certainly a society whose elite depended entirely on slaves. And I traced that. I mean, that, by the way, that itself is a very unusual thing. I mean, elites usually find ways of exploiting the masses of their own societies. It's very unusual for an elite to suddenly find itself without its exploited masses. And that we can track to one important event, or rather the serial development in the late 7th century BC, with the growing restiveness of debt bondage. There's large-scale debt bondage in Athens from the late 8th going right down to the late 7th. And there's every evidence that there was, it was on the verge of rebellion. And it's to avert that Solon, the so-called Solon the Liberator, he was liberating more his class than the masses, sort of, accepted the abolition of debt bondage, which then created a crisis, a labor crisis for the elite. And the way in which the elite solved the problem was to bring in slaves. This is in the simplest terms. And throughout the course of the 6th century, you find this development. You're bringing in a large number of people from outside into society, and which went along with the growth of an urban economy, which was totally dependent on slavery, dependent on the mines, the silver mines of Lorraine, which is sort of had the most horrendous form of slavery in history, as well as, but increasingly, and it's the several recent works have sort of emphasized the extraordinary role which slaves played, not just in the home farms, and in the mines, but also in the urban economy. Those wonderful statues you see, those wonderful buildings, almost the entire technical class, artisanal class, were slaves. Even the policemen of all the public works were done by slaves. I mean, so the urban economy, which is the heart of the civilization, was totally dependent on slavery. And that had never happened before.
And one thing I got from your work, which I guess you sort of know but you don't think about, is how powerful like some slaves could be. Like how senior the risk, like when you get to Rome, like you get slaves of the emperor and stuff, who were some of the most powerful men in the world, which is an insane thought. But staying with Greece, you've got this development of large-scale slavery, and then that's going. How is that generative of freedom?
Okay, so what's new now? Before this, slaves were always marginal to the economy, and because of course in the Eastern societies they were not important at all. I mean, you had corvée labor, you had peasants, and so on. And in the ancient Near East, they were primarily domestic. But now you had this complete dependence on slavery. Now remember something I said earlier. Especially in an advanced economy such as Rome, such as Greece and later Rome, an advanced urban economy, you had a real motivation problem. If you had a motivation problem earlier, you had an even bigger one now. And the way in which you motivated slaves was through the method of manumission, of offering them the prospect of freedom. And, in spite of all these horrors, there's a very high rate of manumission in Greece. There's an even higher rate in Rome. In fact, one estimate, which has been questioned more recently, is that by the age of 36 or so, the average slave in Rome who worked hard could expect to buy his freedom. That was essential for the system. So now you had a large number of people, many of whom were highly educated, who are highly skilled, who were desiring one thing and one thing only, and could only be motivated by getting that thing, and that is the freedom which came from not being a slave. And so there you had this idea, but becoming critical for a critical mass of the population, which you've never had before, nowhere in the Near East. I mean, these were not just domestics. These were architects. These were policemen. These were bureaucrats. And so you begin with them. This being free for a critical mass of the population being important.
And then, so just to really nail this in, you then have created a society through the process that you described, where possibly a majority of the people living in that society either were slaves, or their parents were slaves, or their grandparents were slaves. You've got a case where maybe even a majority of the people in that society, someone in their family had gone through the process of slavery and manumission.
Not quite yet. That's Rome. That's Rome. In Greece, you had a huge number of people who were slaves or ex-slaves. We have the demographic data is just not there. I mean, some people have estimated as much as a third of the population, but we don't know. We know it's large. No, what you had was another important development, which explains how the elites got into it. Not only were they slave owners and therefore were encouraging this notion of freedom, but you also had the threat of enslavement to the population as a whole from foreign powers, and it was the Persian, the near collapse, the near defeat by the Persians, which became one of the really decisive moments in Greek history. This had been the early part of the 5th century, and the threat of becoming slaves and the idea of being free of that threat, and the great defeat of the Persians being interpreted as a triumphant expression of Greek freedom, because of the escape from enslavement, mass enslavement to the Persians, became very important, especially for the elite, who then began to celebrate freedom in a more, if you like, a collective way. But they were the ones who, at the same time, were also encouraging freedom among the people they were enslaving within their own societies. So you had this remarkable convergence of elite celebration of how they preserved something, of how they succeeded in preventing Greece from becoming slaves, freedom, as well as internally the development of the idea of freedom among the people they were enslaving and freeing. And by the last half of the 5th century, there was this convergence of elite glorification. In fact, they use an old idea, arete, which meant glory, honor, power, but which
horribly translated as virtue, which is just not the modern word.
No, it wasn't right, and which now came to be identified as freedom, whichever one was sort of talking about. And so in the secular, you get, by the time you get to Pericles, the elites have, come to see and to accept this notion of freedom, which their idea of which, and now, and this is where, of course, my idea of freedom becomes somewhat more complex than a simple escape from freedom, or rather the Greek idea, because what do you have in the slave situation? You have the slave, you have the slave owner, and you have those who were never enslaved, who were free. And they begin to define their condition as a desirable one, not being a slave. You see, these are the hoplites, and the free. Don't remember that Greece was not Rome. The majority of the quote unquote non-slave were still the small farmers who had been freed from debt bondage way back by Solon, right? And so they had already begun to cherish an idea of not being debt bonded. And when you brought in a lot of slaves, it was even more reinforced by the fact that they were not them. The barbarians, non-Greek, we are this superior group who are the non-slaves, in other words, the free. So you had a convergence of forces, this sort of large mass of free, proud, non-slave small farmers. You had who were celebrating the fact that they were not slaves, and that they were both historically, that they were no longer debt bondmen, and that was their great victory, as well as not being slaves, these people who were being brought in. So there's that notion of freedom. And you had the notion of freedom from the elite, who celebrated the fact that they were powerful, and power becomes an important element in defining what to the slave master's view of freedom. The idea of being in absolute control and being able to defend your country as well as to exercise power within your own society. And of course, there was the slave for whom it was simply a matter of getting the hell out of this horrible situation. In other words, the negative freedom. So what emerged now from the very beginning is a tripartite idea of freedom. So it was much more complex. It's very complex development. So you had the slave's idea. Freedom is being not under the domination of another. Liberation. You had the idea emerging among the mass of the free farmers of we being free by virtue of we being part of the collective entity, which is Greek which will not be dominated by anyone else and who are not slave. And you had the idea of freedom as power. So I refer to this in Freedom in the Making of Western Culture as a triad, as a chordal triad. I use a musical metaphor. And it's important to recognize this idea emerging together. It's not just the slave negative idea. Indeed, often the elites may even look down on that. Although they recognize that if you're going to be free in the sense of exercising power, you have to be free in the sense of not being under the power of another. And then you had the idea of being free in the sense of sharing in a collective power and not being part of that despised group who, there are horrible descriptions of slaves in two-footed stock. And so by the end of the 5th century, you had this triad emerging, and so it's a remarkable development, not only in the sense that freedom became such a powerful idea, but that it had this rather complex tripartite feature about it. So, in which slavery was central. Then I usually use the triangle: power in the middle, or rather slavery in the middle, and freedom is the sense of not being a slave, negative freedom. Freedom is the sense of exercising absolute power, and freedom in the sense of sharing in that collective power and not being a slave, and sharing with the master class the idea of belonging, sort of Herrenvolk notion. They were all there in the seas of freedom, and you have to understand how then the slave owner became involved in celebrating this idea, as well as the ex-slave, as well as people who were neither slave owners and slaves, but who took pride in the fact that we are among the beloved. In fact, it is sort of a revival, an extension of the old notion of freedom as among the beloved, which the farmers, the small farmers who were free, who became very proud of the fact that they were Greek, they were not barbarians, they were not slaves, and barbarians and slaves became identified, and so those three ideas sort of emerge in this remarkable sort of synthesis by the latter half of the 5th century. This is the most remarkable sort of cultural development in at that time.
Can I offer you like a sort of grand historical narrative of like exactly what's on the line with this development here? Because this is a sort of view I've developed that sort of sits uncomfortably with my sort of political left-wing leanings, but it's not in your work, but it's sort of developed from reading your work, which is the other thing we have to remind ourselves is that human civilization is already 3,000 years old at this point. Like, if you track the earliest writings and so on in Egypt, in Babylon, and in so on. So you have a situation where the so-called Fertile Crescent, you have about half of all the people living in the world are living in, like, I guess we're not supposed to use the word the Middle East, but that sort of area, and in Egypt and so on. And you've had, essentially, I don't want to say stasis, there were some developments, but the highest orders, the highest values were those of stability and order, and like you get this with the Persians and Cyrus in particular, of like maintaining the world rather than like building or growing the world. And then you get this value that appears in Greece that's so socially revolutionary and dynamic. And like I was really adverse to this because you get someone like John Stuart Mill, who I do like, said that the Battle of Marathon was more important in British history than the Battle of Hastings. And when you read that the first time, it just sounds like the worst sort of like British flag-waving self-congratulation in the world, right? But then, you know, I read your book, and you have this idea that this was not inevitable, that this value develops, and it must be acknowledged that its survival was not an unmitigated moral good, in that the survival of this value is going to lead to the West eventually way down the road brutalizing and enslaving the entire rest of the world and all of the evil involved with that, but it's also going to lead to the genuine advances and cultural accomplishments of the West. That is genuinely on the line at the Battle of Marathon. You've got these 9,000 Greek hoplites defending what must be acknowledged was an evil and exploitative slave society, even by the standards of the day. But if they are defeated, which everyone expected them to be, then you might just get another 3,000 years of the Fertile Crescent and the Near East and the Babylonians. Like, the whole thing of human history might not happen. Human history is genuinely on the line at Marathon, or at least that's a not implausible reading of it.
Right. Now, let's say Western history.
Yes. Okay.
I just got back from 10 extraordinary days in China, and all sort of things were going on over there. They were already way ahead in many respects. So let's say Western history. Yes, because you're by the second century you're dealing. Well, by the third century you have the emergence of the Han Dynasty. And by the way, one of my favorite classicists is several of them, in fact, are now been sort of drawing interesting parallels between Greece and China, and at about the same time. But I mean, that's highly speculated. The important point is that things were happening in China and Japan, which are different. But Western history, yes, I'm prepared to admit that there were developments here which could have gone in very different ways, and had it not been for Marathon, maybe, but other developments too. I mean, but remember, just to one could test this idea, of course, by looking at what happened in Sicily when the Athenian army was totally defeated, and later on, I mean, it didn't lead to the collapse of civilization, but then one could say that these weren't Persians; they were, in a way, fellow Greeks who defeated.
And also, Athens itself physically survived, however scarred they were by the experience.
Yes. So we're, as I said, it took me quite some time to acknowledge what the facts seem to be stating. And by the way, a lot of people don't accept this. So that one person whom I greatly respect, and I'm sure you do too, has been somewhat critical, gently so, and that's Amartya Sen, the very eminent philosopher, economist. Amartya refuses to accept this reading of history and freedom. He's written very sort of lucidly, powerfully on freedom himself, but he has stated flatly that it happened in India, but the examples he gives is rather odd. Because I've said to him, look, I'm not saying that the simple idea of being that is good not to be a slave didn't exist, in the same way that the simple idea of not being homeless is a good idea. Obviously, it's such a simple idea, at least in its most basic, not being a slave notion, that anywhere slaves existed, they would want to be free. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this very complex, very powerful valorization of a cultural trope, a cultural value, which then becomes the preeminent value in the civilization. There's nothing like this anywhere else in the world. The fact that some Indian sage may one day sort of get up and say, well, this might be a good idea, but it was born there and it died there. Then simply say it's in this text, this ancient Sanskrit text, it misses the whole point. The point being that you have this extraordinary valorization of an idea which originated under such extraordinary circumstances. And how did this happen, and why did this happen? And the fact that it happened only once in ancient Athens, and is truly extraordinary. And there's no denying that fact, because I can see. I mean, in fact, I spent a long chapter trying to explain why it didn't happen elsewhere, even though you had slavery, and which I think I haven't seen a good response.
So what's the answer to why it didn't happen elsewhere?
It didn't happen. We already mentioned that you did not have large-scale slave society. Sir Moses Findlay made this critical distinction between slave-holding societies, which you get everywhere, and slave society which becomes almost completely dependent, certainly an elite totally dependent on slaves. That is the crucial new structural factor in ancient Athens. Nowhere else did that exist, not in any of the Near Eastern societies. When the Near Eastern societies, by the way, the Greeks may have possibly exaggerated. I mean, well, no, they didn't. But if had they been, you take the counterfactual, defeated at Marathon, what they would have done with them is what they had done with a lot of other peoples, and it's all over the Bible, and it's all over the ancient Near Eastern history, which is to make them subject peoples. Or they may have carted off quite a few of them and done with them as had been done by the Egyptians with the Jews. That is to say, replanted them somewhere else and as subject peoples. Or subjected them in their own lands in which they paid tribute and so on. But the world before Athens did not find slavery a good idea as a way of exploiting people. The Chinese, who built great structures, great walls, and great civilizations with those elaborate irrigation works, found other ways of exploiting people. They used the corvée system. I think there are lots of ways in which you can exploit people other than by slavery, and there are other more efficient ways even. The Chinese, I mean, there was slavery in Han China, and there was slavery right through. The Koreans had a fair degree of slavery, but by and large, in most Eastern societies, and in most all Near Eastern societies, the individual enslavement of people on a large scale was not found to be a very sort of efficient way of exploiting people.
There's this really powerful idea of like how surprising history is and how surprising things that seem inevitable to us really were. It's not, I mean, it's one, just quite surprising that you get this invention of slave societies, as you say, but then from that, just very morally evil invention, right? Then this weird new, I love your phrase, you say strange and uninnocent value appears. It's not, if you can try and to the extent you can without getting into anachronism, if you could try and situate yourself in the mental framework of someone in a Near Eastern society at the time, this is not a development you would at all expect.
No. And in fact, there are writings about it. So we have several. There's a collection of writings on advices to princes, in which the one of the advices about slaves and how to deal with them, and this is an elaborate set of instructions about that the best slave is one who comes from abroad. Don't trust locals, and so on and so forth. But I mean, these are all domestics, and the idea of freeing them was not, and the idea of being free never occurs to in any of the writings, and people who became free. Thought the best thing to do is to quietly forget about it. I mean, even if you remained in the household of the prince, as many of them did, you want to forget about it. By the time you got to Rome, and I don't know if you want to move to Rome, because this idea, which emerged in Greece, sort of achieved its maturity and really expanded in Rome, because Rome was even more of a large-scale slave society than Greece, in a way which is just incredible. I mean, Rome was the greatest of all largest of all slave societies, and that includes modern slavery. The work, there's a lot of more recent work, Walter Scheidel and others who've now worked on the demography of slavery and brought us a lot of fascinating new insights. It is incredible. The more I think about it, I never fail to be astonished by how extensive slavery was. Because in Greece, there's very little, apart from the home farms of the elite. You did not have latifundia farming.
Go ahead and cash out the latifundia word.
Oh, sorry. Latifundia is the word for ancient plantation.
And you have, if you envisage something like Jamaica, where you have the majority of the population as slaves, and basically that is the mode of production, economically speaking, a lot of parts of the Roman Empire looked like that, right? And we sort of forget that aspect of Rome, because then this is what I really love about your work, is I think there's like two grand historical narratives, one which you might call the Western triumphalist narrative, and the other which is sort of like a reaction against that wants to go back and point out all the evils in it. And I think what your work does is it sort of shows this tragic interplay of good and evil in Western history.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Out of evil cometh some good, but also a lot of future evils. And it goes right through to modern times. I don't know how far you want to come, but let me just give you one of the big paradoxes, which is so obvious that I'm always amazed that people fail to appreciate it. But the American Revolution and its creation of this great democratic system and this great document, this instrument, the Declaration of Independence, and what was created. The Americans still celebrate their Constitution as one of the great movements in the history of freedom, which sadly it is. But it was all the work of slaveholders. So one of the things which I think my work does is, and when I come forward this far, my response, of course, American historians have sort of gnashed their teeth and tear their hair, saying, oh, we've got this great invention, or great contribution to society. Isn't it a tragedy? Isn't it sad that this is done by large-scale slave owners?
But it's like it's a blot on their history, whereas it was an instrumental part of its creation. It was one of the processes that led to it. It's not like it was great, but as in like, oh, I really support this politician, but he had an affair that's separate from his work. It's instrumental to the work.
Instrumental. It's not an accident that it was the slaveholders of Virginia who led the revolution and wrote the Constitution. It's good and evil, and it goes all the way back in Western history. So it's not an accident that the slave South celebrates freedom more than any other part of the United States. This contradiction is an inherent part of Western history, and most historians are very reluctant to accept this. The narrative is either got to be good or bad, and what I'm saying is that often in the worst of evils you find good emerging, and often in the best of, as you know, some of the worst tragedies emerge from the best of intentions. But
thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. Next week will be the third and final part of this interview series, where we move on to cover freedom in Rome, in late Stoicism, and in early Christianity, and what all of that means for the way we think today. One quick update on the show is last week I asked for some feedback on whether we should do paid ads on the podcast, or whether I should just every now and again ask you all to sponsor me on Patreon, and I got some mixed feedback on that. A few more people did sign up on Patreon, so real big thank you to everyone who did that, and a few people just said, well, if ads are the cost of doing business, then so be it. So I'll take all of that under advisement. I'm going to stick to the way we're doing it for now, and I'll let you know in advance any changes. As always, if you do want to support the show, go on our website and you can share it, you can forward it to friends, or you can sponsor us on Patreon at whatever level you're comfortable with. And I sponsored a couple of people on Patreon myself recently just to practice what I preach. It's super easy to do. Like, whenever people ask for money to sponsor online content, I think it's really easy to just pass that by. But it's actually pretty easy to do as well, so if you're liking the show, please do check that out. Also, follow us on social media. I'm going to be making some announcements of some really awesome guests who I've just recorded conversations with recently, or I'm going to be talking to over the next couple of weeks. So Facebook and Twitter are the best places to get updates about who's coming on the show and the directions that we're going with it. Apart from that, thanks to everyone who supports the show by sharing or sponsoring, and thank you for listening to this episode. Until next week.